Okay, so let's talk about the bewitching. I have many questions about the bewitching, but I want to know, where did these characters come from for you? Who did you meet first and how did they come together?
I wanted to do a work that was somehow related to witchcraft for a long time, and I was drawing on the witchcraft traditions of Mexico, which is where I'm from. So the first section, 1908, is based on the folklore that I grew up hearing from my great-grandmother, stories from central Mexico. The New England portion is inspired by the time that I spent living in Massachusetts, in that area close next to Salem, and a different kind of um, witchcraft folklore that you find in the United States. And I think what I wanted to do is I wanted to get away from what has become probably the most popular notion of witchcraft and witches nowadays, which is sort of the witchcraft with the pointy hat uh, idea, and also the benign witch. We see a lot of good witches nowadays, witchcraft as a superpower, something that is kind of good and nice. And I wanted to return to the folklore that I grew up with, which was very different, and also go back to some of that New England folklore, which also has very different connotations than what we find nowadays in popular media, where witches are more like superheroes than probably anything else.
I have to say, so I've been to Salem and I've been in that area of Massachusetts and into Rhode Island that are in the book, Providence and stuff. So reading it, and I was there in November. So you get the cozy fall witchy vibes. And so I really appreciated the setting was absolutely excellent. And for people who haven't been to that area and haven't heard those stories, it's very accurate. But who was the character that you knew was your first character in the story, or did you have the three women? Like, who was the first person that spoke to you and said, "This is going to be the basis for this book that you build around"?
I normally focus a lot on the setting and the timelines. Initially, I wanted to do something that was set in Mexico, and I knew it was going to be early 20th century, but having also been in Massachusetts and knowing that area, I was thinking about doing something different set in more modern times. And eventually the idea became that I could have both timelines. I didn't need to just do one. And the 1930s timeline became a bit of a bridging section that interconnected both the 1990s and the 1908 time period in Mexico. So they emerged because I really wanted to do two things. I couldn't decide which one I wanted to do. And after considering some of the parallelisms and some of the stuff that I was interested in talking about, I figured out that it actually worked better if we had these time periods running next to each other as opposed to just picking one.
Do you believe in ghosts?
No, I don't. I live in a very old house, and no.
Is that by protection or by pragmatism?
I've lived in a lot of very old houses, and I've never seen anything odd. So I do remember when I was an RA in Massachusetts, sometimes the girls in the dorm would try to scare the other girls by flipping a picture around and pretending that a ghost had flipped it. And so the only ghosts that I could meet were just pranksters trying to scare other students during Halloween time, that kind of situation.
Do you
And yeah,
believe
I've lived
in
in some very old buildings, and the scary thing is, I guess, asbestos in Canada. That's the scariest thing that you find.
do you believe in witches?
No, I do not either, but I grew up with a tradition, a syncretic tradition of witchcraft and folklore in which that kind of blends magic with everyday life. So Mexico has an interesting culture. It has been traditionally for many years mostly Catholic country, and yet it delights in certain kind of pagan customs and things like if you want to get married, there's a saint that you put his you put him upside down and you tell him that you're gonna put not gonna put him upright until he finds you a husband. In the Caribbean, you might offer certain fruits or food to certain saints, And the thing is that the saints are tied to African traditions, where the saint is on the front of the picture, and on the back of the picture, there's a Loa, an ancient deity that comes before colonization. And so it's a form of worshiping an ancient god while still maintaining the pretense of being involved in the Catholic religion. So I come from a world in which um, common household witchcraft charms, all those kinds of things still remain, and especially in the times of my great-grandmother, a part of everyday life. And it is not an unusual thing to have some of those things around your house. Love charms are especially common, and money charms are also really common. And I would say the other one would be health charms, but love charms are always, there's always a market for them, up to nowadays, even though if you go to Mexico City, you got the same things that you have in Canada: cell phones, high-speed internet, very fast cars, tall skyscrapers. Some of these ideas and traditions still remain, and they coexist with, like I said, the Catholic religion. There's not that problem with thinking, oh, the church would be against this. Mexicans love to have pagan stuff, and you know, no matter what the priest says, you will do it. You will have it.
So where does your love of, is this by just by natural upbringing and by family interest that you fall into some of these topics? When I look at the books that you've written previously in this one, there's some history to them, there's some magic to them. Where does that interest come from?
I write in a wide category of genres. I do write a lot of historical. My interest in fantastic fiction came a lot because of my mother, as she was very interested in horror novels in the 1980s. So she had Stephen King by her bedside, and Clive Barker, Anne Rice, those kinds of writers. So she allowed me to read those books, and I grew up reading that kind of fiction. It was very normal around my house. And through them, I started also reading other kinds of speculative fiction writers. I started reading science fiction, people like Isaac Asimov, and also some fantasy, moved into Tolkien, that kind of stuff. There was also my great-grandmother's oral tradition, which is a different kind of story. It's an oral narrative that includes a lot of folklore. And there was, of course, all the bevy of Latin American literature that you are exposed to as you grow up in Mexico. And so I also grew up reading other writers that are not considered writers of the fantastic in the sense of the categories of fantasy and science fiction that you find in a normal bookstore, but that nevertheless sometimes straddle these different categories. They have elements of the unreal in their fiction. And so those are people like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, like Isabel Allende, like those kinds of writers, and other ones. And so I come from kind of like a mixed tradition, different sorts of literary traditions all coming together.
How old were you when you started reading Stephen King? I ask that question because there was a version of me that loved reading horror novels. When I say horror, I mean like R.L. Stine, which is like baby horror. So you're right into Stephen King with your mom's interests. How old were you when you started reading Stephen King?
I was probably a tween. I started reading Edgar Allan Poe when I was about 11, and then I migrated to Lovecraft, and then came, I think, Stephen King and some of the more modern horror writers. I didn't really, R.L. Stine, those books were not really translated in Mexico, so I did not have access to any of that. It was very much youth literature in that time period. If you wanted to read something geared towards young adults, there was not that category. We were talking about, they would tell you to read The Three Musketeers or 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. That was what passed as kind of youthful literature. Maybe you would find a translation of Black Beauty, those sort of things. So you pretty much graduated from, like adventure novels of the 19th century into modern contemporary fiction with popular writers, which would have been your Stephen Kings of the world and your Anne Rices. There was no middle ground. So I did read a lot of Dumas and those kinds of authors. Those were the adventure novels of the time era, Little Women, those kinds of books, Dickens. That's what passed as young adult literature.
I like that you go from Little Women to like It.
Yeah. Well, I like horror. I always did, and
Mhm.
it wasn't. There was no literature that was forbidden in my household by my mother, so she did not have age appropriate or inappropriate categories. My mother figured if you wanted to read, that was really good. Um, you know, society literacy rates, they were not very high among my peers, even people who were middle class or had more of an education. Almost nobody had lots of books. My parents were journalists, so they were in kind of like a different kind of category, where my father used to say that we were poor in money, rich in culture, because we had a lot of books and a lot of CDs and, well, LPs back in the day and things like that, poetry just floating around the household as opposed to a lot of material things. And so I grew up in a household in which knowledge and learning and literature was what my parents believed was that you should just read it all. And there was no problem. And after, I went through the phase of reading Greek myths and stories, and did that, the Odyssey and compendiums of that, and reading Shakespeare and Cervantes and the Three Musketeers. And I got tired eventually of that, and I was looking for something else, and horror came at that time period, and it was just very fun. And because my mother had read them, I could chat with her about the,
Yeah.
I could tell her, what did you think about this? And she could tell me what she thought about it. So it was very nice to be able to talk to somebody about it. So we had a lot of really good conversations about those books. And yeah, I read a lot of Stephen King when I was young, but I also read a lot of Ray Bradbury when I was young, which was less gritty and lots of swords and lasers kind of books uh, that are no longer popular, but I still remember fondly. Things that nobody else remembers probably.
So, what is it about horror books that appeals to you? Do you like to be scared? Do you like the story structure? Do you like the character building? What about it? What about it appeals to you? And do you watch horror movies too?
Yes, I watch horror movies too, not as many as I used to when I was younger. I have less time these days. I used to just go to the video store and rent a bunch of things and watch everything over the weekend when I was younger. Not kind of don't do that um, that much. But I think genres are just simply different ways of painting pictures. So sometimes you can take a realist picture of your environment with a camera, with your iPhone or with some other kind of camera, and you get an exact shot of a person at that time and place. But you can also paint a portrait, and depending on the style that you're painting, you can end up with an impressionistic painting and or a surrealist painting, or you can end up with um, all kinds of different stuff, and yet that painting is not less real or accurate to life just because it's not the same as a snapshot. When Van Gogh paints lights over a city, and they're swirling lights which cannot exist in real life, no sky looks like that. Yet that Starry Night is an iconic painting, and it represents something special about that landscape. So it's the same with horror and with fantasy and science fiction and other categories. They just allow you to paint pictures in different ways. And horror gives you certain tools that you don't necessarily find in romance, or you don't necessarily find when you are reading noir. So it just provides you with a way to looking at different experiences. I find horror sometimes very useful as a category for certain things.
What are some of those tools that you can use in horror that you wouldn't, I mean, aside from maybe some, murder, that you wouldn't use in like romance, but what tools are you using differently in that kind of story versus like a contemporary romance?
Well, for example, if you're talking about pregnancy, you can write a novel where a woman is pregnant and she is ambivalent about the child and about her marriage, or you can write Rosemary's Baby. And not saying that serious kind of, very lifelike drama is bad at all, but I think Rosemary's Baby, if you've ever watched the movie or read the book, it captures some of the anxieties of a first-time mother very well. It's an old book. It has aged in some ways. I read it recently. I was a bit like, oh, that doesn't really, But in other ways, it still rings somewhat true to life too. Um, how you feel when you're having a child for the first time, all those fears becoming physical. My friend who is pregnant right now, she said that she thought she had a parasite inside, and she loves her parasite. Still, it's a weird experience when you feel for the very first time. Have you ever had a child kick in your womb? It is a little bit uncanny. And I think Rosemary's Baby, for example, captures that experience very well. I went to see, there's been several body horror movies recently, but it was the one with Demi Moore, The Substance.
The Substance, yeah.
Yeah, it was a riot. The whole movie theater was just having a lot of fun. I mean, The Substance is about aging in parts and women and perhaps waking up one day. And I am 44, and I have this year seen my body change in ways that I didn't kind of expect. They say now that you age in faster bursts rather than over a period of time. And I think I am in my fast burst where I'm waking up some mornings and finding hairs where I didn't think they were before. I'm like, I swear to God, that hair was not in that place last night. I think it grew overnight. And I do think that The Substance, in that sense, it captures some of that horrific sense of aging and the pressures of being a woman, having to present yourself into the world, which again, we could do a documentary about that, about what it's like
I see what you're
to
saying.
be menopausal. But The Substance, if you go watch it, I think you get something out of it that maybe a documentary kind of format doesn't give you.
I will say The Substance was good until the ending. The ending, they lost me.
Well,
It gets a little crazy at the end. If you haven't seen it, it gets a little, it gets you, and then it goes into the beyond. So do you consider The Bewitching a horror novel then?
Yes, I call it a supernatural suspense novel because I think that unfortunately, sometimes when people say horror, they think if it's not terrifying and I don't have a heart attack in the first 2 pages, then it's not a horror novel. I think that's a misinterpretation of horror novels. If you've ever read Dracula, Dracula is a horror novel, and the first few dozen pages are Jonathan Harker kind of talking about how he's having a shitty time at an Airbnb that he's visiting. Not really that, terrifying. And the same could be said of works like Turn of the Screw. Turn of the Screw is a really good novella, but it's very quiet. We start with the governess, and first she gets the job, then she arrives and she meets everybody, she meets the children, everything's normal, and then something happens, right? So the idea that horror is like there's a clown with an axe, around the corner at the very beginning, and that's going to be a horror novel, or that you're not scared of it, it's not a horror novel, I think negates the power of a lot of works, which are not exactly seeking to do that, but are still categorized in this thing that we call horror, like The Haunting of Hill House. So I would say, I like to say a novel supernatural suspense because I think it sets the stakes a little bit more realistically, so people don't think there's a killer clown on page 2. There's no killer clown on page 2. I'm sorry, but
There's no clowns at all, actually.
There's a fun novel called Clown in a Cornfield. There are novels about killer clowns. It is a novel with a killer clown, although it turns out to be something else. But then you'll find out it's a magical creature at the end. But yeah, so I just think it's just to try to offer people a truth in what's inside the tin can, right?
So you love fantasy, science fiction, horror, this genre that typically was not reserved for women. It was typically men who wrote and read those genres. Being in that space now, do you find that there are more women, or are your colleagues still mostly men?
There are a lot of women, although it is a misconception that there were no women in the fields of science fiction, horror, and fantasy. I just did an introduction for Jirel of Joy Reid stories, which are by C.L. Moore, Catherine Lucille Moore, who was a pioneering writer of science fiction and fantasy back in the 1920s, 1930s. She was writing at the same time that Robert E. Howard, who made Conan, was writing, and H.P. Lovecraft, who was very famous for Cthulhu, were writing, and she was a correspondent of them. And C.L. Moore is kind of important. And so I wrote an
Mhm.
introduction to some of her stories that are being reissued. And when I was looking at some of the material that I was looking at, there were, I think, over 100 women that appeared in the magazine Weird Tales before C.L. Moore made her debut in with her story Chamblou, and very good story. So there were 100 women before her in that magazine, iconic magazine, very important for the development of horror, science fiction, those kinds of stories. The editor was a woman of that magazine at that point in time. There were recurring writers of that time period who were very well known. So about, a good percentage of the readership of Weird Tales was also women, because they would write letters to the editor at that time period, and you would see, that it was women there. So there was a wide ecosystem of women kind of working in that time period. Early 20th century, the dawn of these categories as we know them today. What happens a lot of times is that they're easily forgotten. And in general, writers are easily forgotten, but a lot of these writers, we simply don't remember what they did. We don't save their work. This was pulp fiction, which is considered disposable fiction. And therefore, we don't tend to archive or study a lot of this stuff. So a lot of these people have been forgotten. There was nobody to remember them. And especially if they were women, perhaps less care was given to them. Sometimes they were classified as something else. We see sometimes people say, oh, no, it's not really horror, it was romance, that kind of situation. And when you look back, you realize it really should have been in this other category. So you do have that happening a number of times throughout history. But by the time we get to the 1970s and 1980s, there is a big number of women writing fantasy and science fiction, less so horror, perhaps at that time period in huge numbers, but there are a lot of women doing this kind of work. And nowadays, we do see a lot of women writing horror, recognizable names. If you go to a bookstore, you will see a lot of women in that section. And of course, a huge number in the fantasy section, especially in categories that cross over, like romantic fantasy, romantasy. You see it's really huge numbers of women, where you would be almost hard pressed now to find men in some of these subcategories. You don't see a lot of men doing some of these young adult fantasies, that kind of work. So women, I think, have been part of the scene for a really long time. They have been perhaps less visible in certain time periods, or their work has not been considered that important in certain time periods, but they have been there for a really long time. And nowadays, they are a lot more visible in the field of horror. And the truth is, the field of horror for a really long time, for over 20 years, was not a very active field, because in general, publishers moved away from horror after the 1990s. And so a lot of people were just not working there in general, both men and women. There were not a lot of books that were being bought in those categories by mainstream imprints. And so we did spend a period of over 20 years in which horror simply was kind of foul ground. Nothing was growing there. Very few people, a lot of independents, very small presses, that kind of work. Because mainstream, you would go into a bookstore and there would be no horror section in that time period.
Is that why you made that search for Beatrice in the letters? Is that part of the research, like finding this female author who had this connection and doing all this research? Was that part of it, or is this just something that you happen to be looking at that's also part of your book?
No, I knew about some of the pioneering women of horror, and how it has taken a long time for them to get kind of attention and recognition. And it's slowly happening. I have seen in the past 8 years some more studies dedicated to looking at maybe some of these pioneering women, some of their work, but a lot of attention was not given to them for a really long time. C.L. Moore, the writer that I mentioned, even though she is very important and formative for the history of science fiction and fantasy, hasn't had a biography written about her so far. So we have had other writers of this era of fantasy and science fiction and horror who do get biographies, and nobody has put in the work to kind of go back and look at the biographical material of this woman. And there is enough there to do the biographical work. So it's not somebody that, they left no trace of themselves. We don't know what they did. kind of situation. There's a lot of material, but so far people haven't kind of turned back and looked at this. So it is something that is changing right now. But in the time period when this book is written, cultural studies that look at science fiction, fantasy, and horror, and women, especially in that section, wouldn't have been so active. So this would have been considered a very minor kind of field of study. So maybe there wouldn't have been those many scholars around there. Now I see a lot more scholars of the fantastic and science fiction going and doing this kind of work. But 20, 25 years ago, really, your professor would have probably told you not to pursue that kind of academic avenue. It was not going to lead somewhere very good.
Like a don't bother type
Don't
situation.
bother, yeah.
The reason women is because of the community that has been found in the romantasy world of books like the Following series, Sarah J. Maas's books, and the conventions we're seeing pop up, the book talk community, reading about dragons and magic and fairies and all of these things that some people are just picking up as adults for the first time. But I do notice in bookstores that there are more women in the fantasy and science fiction section now than there are men. Is that something that like, are you reading these books too? Are you in on the pop culture craze of these romantasy books?
No, I'm not a big romantasy reader, but I am aware of the genre. There are also a lot of editors and people in publishing who are women. I would say the majority are women. If you walk into a room that publicists, I mean, my whole team is, I think, all women, except for there's one guy up in publicity. But the people that I interact with regularly at Penguin Random House are all women. It's a very female-dominated kind of profession nowadays. Not talking about the 1950s and Mad Men. And the same is true for other professions. I mean, medical doctors are more likely to be women nowadays. Things do change. So that shift has changed. Lots of women are just interested in reading more than men and this kind of hobby, if you want it. So a lot of book clubs are women are the ones who join, not so much the guys. Or if the guys join, they want to read nonfiction, men are more likely to read biographies and other kinds of books as opposed to narratives, which seem to be more likely to be explored by women. So there is a big boom in certain areas, and romantasy is just one area that has grown really a lot in the past 5 years. Before that, we had young adult that was also very heavy on women, a lot of female interests. I think some of the hobbies that women naturally favor are just kind of right for that curatorial role of books. Women are more likely to want to collect pictures and make interesting displays, Pinterest boards, that kind of work. Men are maybe not that likely to want to do that sort of work. And so I think these communities form, they have these shared interests and these shared ways of communicating, and they tend to be very female dominated. A lot of women in those areas, and of course they gravitate then towards certain things that are similar and that they like. And you see that also emerge with marketing trends, sprayed edges. Apparently, everybody loves sprayed.
Oh yeah.
I don't, and really in Canada we don't get that many, but you get a lot in the UK. But you really see women really going gaga over that online and showing their their sprayed edges. So there's just some certain dynamics that I think are well suited for women's culture nowadays, and somehow they seem to connect very well to books as a sort of hobby, as a sharing activity, as opposed to motorcycles. I don't think, I meet a lot of women who are heavily into motorcycles. For example, but that's what my husband loves, motorcycles.
Okay, I want to talk about you.
Mhm.
How did you get your first book deal? You've written many books now, but how did you get your first book deal?
Signal to Noise. I was writing short fiction. I started writing short fiction in 2006, and eventually I got a collection out with a small Canadian press. So I made a name of myself for about 10 years or so as a writer of short fiction in very small magazines all over the place. And so I had a bit of a reputation. People knew me for that kind of work. I had also been editing some stuff here and there. And so I met writers that way, as you do when you're in the field. People get to know you, you get to know them. One of those writers, he knew an editor at a publishing house in the UK, and the editor was looking for new material, interesting things. So my friend said, "Oh, well, Silvia Moreno-Garcia, she's got a book, and and I had tried to get an agent at that point. I hadn't succeeded. I had failed. This was my second novel that I had been working on." And he said, "Yeah, she has a book and it's very interesting." So the editor asked me to see it. It was for a company called Solaris. It was nothing like my book. Solaris publishes the Judge Dredd comic books, if you've ever heard about them. They're very sci-fi kind of stuff, action. I had written a very quiet, introspective book about a woman coming back to Mexico City, and it also had to do with her youth when she cast spells using vinyl records. And so it was a coming of age novel in two time periods, basically. Didn't think it would fit their line. There was certainly nothing like it with them. So I sent it to the editor, and he ended up saying he liked it. And he offered me a contract for a small amount of money, and so it came out in the UK. And then after that, I was writing other stuff, and that book allowed me to get an agent, and then that agent got me more deals. So I was just I got lucky that there was an editor who liked my style, even though it didn't really fit his line at all. It was an odd book. I still think it was really an odd choice to to pick that novel, but I guess it was good for me. And I've been now with my agent for a really long time, and so he keeps negotiating my contracts, and I keep selling books.
When it comes to your work now, are you a full-time writer? This is not, I know we talked to some authors that have best-selling books, but this is not their full-time job. Is this your full-time job?
I've been a full-time freelancer, which is what I call myself because that's the most accurate term, for the past 2.5 years, 3 years, basically. So I had a whole other career in something else before becoming a full-time freelancer and leaving behind my benefits package and all the good things that come when you are employed and you have a union job.
What was it that helped you pull the plug and say, I'm going all in on myself and I can give that up?
Well, my friend Libby, who was the one who helped me get that first novel out, the one who recommended me, I talked to him. He's been a full-time writer for a long time, and he said, have a savings account with 6 months saved of something to live on in case things go wrong. And then I said, well, if they go wrong, I'm afraid that I won't be able, if this doesn't work out, I won't have a job and I won't ever be able to get a job again. And he said, you will be able to get a job again. It's not going to count against you if you go away for 3 years in the line of work that I did. People will think it's a pro with what you did. So he said, so what? If you fail, it doesn't work out, you go back to what you were doing before, that's fine, right? But give it a try, because I was finding it hard to juggle my day job and some of the other work that I was doing. So I did, and that's what I'm doing right now, and that's what I tell myself every day. It's like I can always go back and do something, get a job.
What was what was your first day like when you woke up without a job except for the one you do for yourself?
It was very luck because I never liked getting up early, so it was great. And I still don't like getting up early. It was good not having to get on the bus and do the commute that morning. Yeah.
What impact did being chosen as one of Reese Witherspoon's books have on your career? I've talked to a few different authors who've had books chosen by her. Does it have a really big impact?
Oh, I wasn't chosen by Reese Witherspoon. I wish I was.
Wasn't
I've
Mexican
been
Gothic
chosen for other
chosen
book
for
clubs.
her?
I was a Good Morning America choice last year for the
Oh, is
7th
that
day
what it
of
was? Okay.
Salome. Yeah.
I thought Mexican Gothic was chosen by her.
Nope, it was not. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, I'm sorry. I gave you accolades that you haven't got yet.
It
But
still
do
didn't help.
those, but do those big, like, morning show, big celebrity book clubs, do they, I mean, I'm just a little CBC book club at the library, but do the big ones that have those big hosts and big celebrities, do they have a big impact on your work in terms of getting it out there?
No, it really depends on both the show and the title. Um, because some some shows are, let's say, geared towards certain titles, and certain things will do very well in that type of show. It's that type of audience are going to want to buy
Mm.
that type of book. And others, it's just going to be like it was on the show, but nobody um really cared about it. It's very hard to predict and also to judge what works and what doesn't in book marketing. You have to kind of throw a lot of things at the wall and see what sticks. Really, what works is just as much exposure as you can over a longer period of time. So all the places that you can be on, the better. I find radio shows that are geared towards book listeners are very good, but there's not that many of those nowadays. They used to have this really big audience, better than podcasts, really. And so those really have been the ones where I might have looked at my sales and I said, oh, there was a bump, there was an uptick.
That's
Um,
awesome.
but yeah,
Someone who
it's
works in
good.
radio, that makes me happy.
Yeah.
Um, so, oh God, my brain is still catching up to the rest of the world. Where was I going to go with this? I do want to open this up to the floor because I know that people will have questions, and there's people in the room with me here, there's people online. Um, what are you working on next? What do you have in mind for your next book? You said you keep sending your agent books. So what is next on the docket for you?
We just finished the final proofs for The Entry, which will be out next year. It's a noir. It's set in 1943 in Mexico about this romance scammer guy who's trying to scam this lady and get her money. So he gets the assistance of her niece to do this, and it's about seeing whether it works out or not. So that should be out July 14 of next year.
Well, that's very specific. So you know it's coming out that day.
Oh yeah, yeah. We writers live in the past and in the future. We are often talking about things that we finished 2 or 3 years ago and working towards 1 or 2 years in the future with another project.
What's the best thing you've read lately that is not your own?
I really recommend The Voice of Blood. It's an anthology of stories by a Mexican writer that had not been translated ever before, and is kind of important for understanding the history of fantastic fiction in Mexico. So I really enjoyed that. And yeah, let me see, I can never remember what I'm reading. Oh, Calibas by Nick Mamatas. It's a retelling of The Tempest with a sci-fi spin. And
Oh,
I blurbed it. So I said, an inventive, invigorating science fiction romp. This is a nanoboat Shakespeare, our dystopian lives demand. And so it's called Calibas. It came out today.
okay, Mo, today.
Yeah.
Speaking of, blurbs and reviews, this is what I was going to ask you before when my brain stopped working. Do you read your reviews? Do you venture into Goodreads? I know some authors have a strict, like, I am not interested.
I do get to see most of my clippings that happen in other sorts of spaces, newspapers, magazines, those kinds of stuff, because the publicity people normally put together a package, or I get the Google alert. I don't get to see Goodreads that often, to be honest with you, and it's a very weird space, so I try to stay away from it.
So I find most authors, it's either it will inflate. Like I had a co-host who said to me once, "You're never as good as you think you are, and you're also never as bad as you think you are." And I think that is the summary of Goodreads is either the reviews are like, "This is the best thing I have ever read ever," or "This is terrible, don't waste your time." And there's never anything in the middle that actually gives you some thought into what's been read.
Yeah, I know. Margaret Atwood, worst writer ever. And you're like, really? I don't think you've read it.
Yeah. Did you even read my book or
Yeah.
did you not? Okay, I want to open this up to questions in the room and questions online. I'm going to open it up to online first. If you have a question, just raise your hand, and Sylvia can answer it for you. Please don't be shy. No one has a question. Oh, hang on. Okay, Angie, if you want to unmute yourself.
My question is about Conrad.
Oh, okay.
What happened to Conrad?
He's living his best life.
He was like a red herring. It was just like, is he something? Is he? And then he was nothing. I was just like, that was sneaky. I liked it. So I was just wondering, is there anything that happened with Conrad?
Yeah, no, he was just a bad dude.
Okay.
I finished it last night, so it was fresh in my mind. So thank you.
Any other questions online? No. Okay, I'm gonna open it up to the room then. I'm gonna turn this. Will everyone come into focus, or is it just gonna be a blurry? Oh no, that's a blurry blob. Please hold.
So
Oh,
funny.
it's got the, you know what it is? It has the blur on. Video.
I see a leg.
There we go.
It does look surreal. Okay. Yeah, now I see.
Okay.
Oh, there was a
Now
hand.
that
Oh,
you
now I
can
see
see.
people, humans.
Oh,
All right.
oh, there are in fact people in here. Okay.
Yes,
Anybody?
you never know. You could have been lying about that, and it's there's
I'm
nobody
not a
there at
Goodreads
all.
chat room. Yeah, go ahead.
So I really enjoyed the book. I finished it about a month ago, but I have a question with regard to Elma was raped, sort of raped by her uncle, and I just can't remember his name again. Arturo. And then I believe she was pregnant at the end of that segment in the book.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so then the child could or would have been Minerva's mother. Or somebody.
Can you give us a family flow chart is what she's asking.
It's her great grandma, right? Uncles. It's I don't mean mother's brother, the mother's brother, Arturo. No, Arturo is Minerva's great grandfather.
Does he end up being that?
And well, that's exactly it. Is there a part two coming, because Joel references were more the same than you know. So is she part?
Look at the smile on Sylvia's face right now.
That's where I was going to. Because that's exactly the thought. And then, so she thought, okay, so the warlock is her grandfather, or right, Alma's, yeah. And then the mother in between, they talk about the mother checking in on her at university all the time, how's she doing? Never about the father. So did the father die in a car crash too, like all the other in-betweens?
Okay, Sylvia, you have some explaining to do.
Yeah, no, we don't see the middle generations in that family tree, but
Okay.
the
A lot of the others
great
it was-
grandparents we do meet throughout the novel. Of course, we don't know her great grandfather, who he is, until the very end. But yeah.
Right, that's right, yeah.
And I just want to say, because some people have told me, that is weird. Do you have a thing for avuncular marriages or relationships? It's not, I don't have a thing. However, I will mention that at that time period, Porfirio Diaz, president of Mexico, a very important political figure and longtime dictator, was married to his niece.
I was gonna ask you about that, the whole familial relationship situation. I like that you clarified as I don't have a thing.
No, things that are perhaps not the best sometimes happening in families.
He made my skin crawl, like, in the first 2 minutes of meeting him, I thought, oh, he's slimy. There's something wrong with him, yeah, but I didn't really recognize him as a warlock until later on. I thought he was slimy, but yeah. Anyway, that corner intrigued me.
Okay.
The rest I could explain.
Any other questions?
I listened to it and, the voice of Arturo made him even slimier. And I, so much so that after I watched or listened to the end, I went back and had to listen to us being introduced to him and being, just like, did I miss something? And no, I didn't.
Okay. But you like the audiobook?
The audiobook was very good, because I think I enjoyed hearing the names and hearing a bit of the accent, and I think it just immersed me a little more in the Mexican folklore.
It makes the creepy extra creepy.
It makes it creepy here.
Yeah. Any other comments or questions from the room?
The narrator will be very pleased when I tell her she was very slimy.
So I guess I have a bit of a comment, and I should preface it by saying that I actually teach the witch hunts to my students. And we talk about spiritualism, for example. So I actually found it so fascinating that you didn't, what I would argue is sensationalize spiritualism. You didn't actually, to me, who has students read the history of the Ouija board, you didn't actually sensationalize it, if that makes sense. You didn't turn it into a pop culture item. You used it, in my opinion, in the way it was actually created and intended, right? Which was for purposes of communication. And that's what I found so interesting about it. There wasn't this sort of like engaging with witchcraft as though it's some sort of pop culture sensationalized component. And I'm wondering how, if you find in terms of having conversations with people about the book, is there this idea still of sensationalizing, if you will, witchcraft, sensationalizing Ouija boards, seeing them through that what I call pop culture lens?
Give me a question to my moderator. How can we put that into a question?
Do you see when people are talking about witches and communication with spirits, is it done in a way that is in line with historical record, or is it more in line with like the craft and hocus pocus?
Yeah.
I would say it's often not done in line with the historical record, but it is very interesting to go back and look at what people believe, for example, about spiritism in the early 20th century. It is considered a scientific endeavor. And of course, people are discovering things like X-rays and the planet Pluto, which back then they call a planet, not a planetoid. So there are a lot of mysteries that are emerging in the early 20th century. And of course, the thought process becomes, are ghosts sometimes possible, are mediums plausible? And there's a lot of trickery involved with it. People like Houdini are medium hunters that are exposing people who are doing fraudulent seances, taking photographs of the dead. Also, new technology is being used for this, things like cameras to create double exposures. And so it is not necessarily kind of like the things we see in horror movies, how people are taking some of these spiritualist elements. And you have to remember that the Ouija board is a parlor game. It is trademarked by Hasbro, although it has all these associations with horrific things. It is, a parlor game, and similar parlor games are played throughout different time periods. And I think you get bursts of interest in a kind of spiritualism or different theory explanations in time periods. So you've got that early 20th century time period when people are very interested in this. Then it goes quiet. And then in the 1970s, we have a lot of paranormal studies. Even the army gets in on it, where they're doing things like mental projection, astral projection. Can I, talk to somebody in another room while I'm doing this? And they show up that somebody folding a fork, and are they doing it with the power of their mind? We get a lot of that in the 1970s. And again, it goes down. People are not so interested in that anymore. Nowadays, I see a lot of interest in what I would call pseudo-neo-paganism. We had neo-paganism again in the 1970s. We seem to be having another burst of it right now. Astrology is very big nowadays. You see a lot of, especially women, interested in astrology and some of these other kind of, I guess, alternate methods of viewing the world. So it seems to ebb and flow, to go up and down. It is normally not as spectacular as in the horror movies that are kind of the way they show you the world. So it's never quite like that. It tends to be a lot more every day. But witchcraft is also a lot more every day in regular practice than what we see in horror movies. Like I said, I grew up with a lot of practices that have to do with things to give you luck or to remove luck. And it's not like in the horror films. I mean, I got a charm right now against the evil eye. It's just a little thing that you wear. My mother, I remember sometimes she liked to in Mexico, there was a plant called a sábila, and she liked to tie. Sometimes I would see her tying ribbons around it, and I would leave like, "What are you doing?" And she's like, "Oh, got to get more money into the house, got to get more lucky money. So I'm tying this around this plant, and this will ensure good fortune." That's a lot less spectacular than some of the things that you see in like The Conjuring or the Amityville Horror. It's just kind of everyday sort of situation. And I think if you ever had the tarot cards read to you, which I know a lot of women my age kind of enjoy and a little bit younger, or your natal chart made for you, there weren't explosions and fireworks maybe, and it is a kind of spiritual practice. But yeah, in movies, everything looks really big and lots of sound effects. In real life, everything is probably a lot more quiet, and there's probably a lot of talking if you go to talk to a witchcraft practitioner, and back and forth sharing rather than big bursts of blood coming out of the walls.
Well, the everyday almost seems more plausible though. Like I'm not a horror person. I've read Salem's Lot and watched The Omen. After that, I quit. But reading this book, and just kind of, I came out of it and I'm thinking, was witchcraft a real thing? Like, it's a real thing. So it was very, very well written. I really enjoyed it.
Any other comments online in the room?
Was the third era of the 1990s, is that based on personal experience of an area that you'd like to want to focus on? The 1998 period or Minerva?
So is the 1990s based on personal experiences?
Well, yeah, or just interest, or just personal, or
Yeah, I did wonder about why you set a book that came out in 2025 in 1998 for one of the main scenes. Yeah, I guess, is that personal? Is that when you were around that area?
Yeah, I was going to college around that time, and the really funny thing is that I've had young people now come to me and tell me, I like the book, but when I read the 1998 section, I found it very unrealistic that there would be internet and cell phones in this time period. And I realized, God, I'm aging. So no. People thought some people have told me they thought that was more unrealistic than the seance scenes in the 1930s. They really didn't believe that there was internet in 1998. I just remember all the America Online discs that somehow ended up inside a house. There was always an AOL free disc that they would give you, and you would end up with lots of them. I used them as coasters, to be honest, at a certain point in time.
Okay. Nova has a question online. Nova, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi there. I thought it was interesting how these witches were sort of vampires as well. Like they sucked blood. Is that coming from the Mexican witch tradition, or was that something that you made up, or how did that come about?
Yes, it's Latin American witches in general and witches in the Caribbean. Although there are regional differences, there are also some commonalities, and there are a few commonalities. One is that they can fly through the air, often taking off their legs, and then they fly through the air. They turn into balls of fire. they can often change shape, and they drink blood. This is very common in all of Latin America and the Caribbean, and even the Philippines. I was talking to somebody from the Philippines, and they told me they have similar types of witches. They said for them to get rid of them, if you find a pair of legs in your home because the witch took off her legs and flew off, you sprinkle salt on it, so a bit like a snail, and that gets rid of it. In our case, in Mexico, you throw it into the fire. And then when the witch comes back, she doesn't have legs, kind of situation, but very similar. And so we both figured out that, yeah, these things are just kind of common in folklore throughout the region.
All
Thank you.
right. If I found a pair of legs in my house, I don't know that throw them in the fire would be my first thought, but
I know it works like that in fairy tales and in folk tales. People are very level-headed at times, considering what's going on in some of those folk tales, like Hansel and Gretel, and those children. I don't think I would have known what to do in that situation in the candy house.
just throw them in the fire. It's fine. Okay.
Simon has a question.
Oh,
It says here, she noticed a key in your books that she wanted to ask you about. In the Bewitching, Alba's uncle Arturo desires her in a disturbing way, as already mentioned tonight. And in Mexican Gothic, please cover your ears if you don't want to be spoiler.
can you hear her?
No, you're gonna have to repeat them.
Do you want to unmute yourself so she can hear you?
I can actually
Oh,
ask
wait,
it
Jalissa can ask. Here we go. Jalissa, go ahead.
Yeah.
I had my screen off because I was putting my daughter to bed with my headphones on, so I could attend. But yeah, I was gonna ask that I noticed the theme in your books. I'm repeating because I had typed the question in the chat. So we talked about Arturo desiring and acting on it in a sexual assault with Alba. And then, so anybody who hasn't read Mexican Gothic, cover your ears. So I had read Mexican Gothic before I read the Bewitching. And then I noticed, so like Virgil preys on Noemi in a similar way. And, it's technically like her brother-in-law, and both kind of happen in a semi-conscious state. So I was wondering, was this parallel intentional, and what drew you to explore the dynamic across the different novels?
Yeah, it's well, predatorial men are very common in Gothic fiction, which is one of the things that obviously inspires Mexican Gothic and inspires the section of 1908 in the Bewitching. So you got Heathcliff from Wuthering Heights, romantic hero or great predator. He seems to be both in that novel. And so you do have, I guess, what I call the Byronic man, which is a figure that reoccurs in these kinds of stories. You find him over and over again in certain kinds of narratives. You also have Roderick Usher in the House of Usher and his sister and all these kinds of things. Gothic narratives are about women in danger and the danger coming from inside the house. So instead of this being an external danger, a stranger that you don't know, it really is about the dangers that you encounter in your own kind of space. And so the 1908 section really is about that. It's this Gothic setup, really, that part, and the call is coming from inside the house. The 1998 section, on the other hand, this is an external thing. It's something that is outside, always of Minerva's space, and is trying to break in, literally in a section in which the house is being kind of like shakes and all that kind of stuff. So they're in a way opposite kinds of narrative experiences that are very common in horror fiction. You see both of that. You see it's coming from inside the house, but you also sometimes have the invasive stranger that knock in the middle of the night, and then suddenly something horrible is coming into your space, like Dracula saying, "Let me in, may I come into your space," sort of situation. So they're really supposed to be kind of mirroring those two types of fiction. But yes, it is very common. I think I read a study many years ago and I never forgot it. And it was a study where they asked men and women what were the scariest types of movies that they watched, and men said that it was basically external horror, things where they were in an alien environment and something bad happened. And so they gave us an example of Deliverance being very scary, a 1970s movie. But women said things like The Exorcist, stories where the horror is inside the house. And so I think that I've never forgotten that study, and that is something that I also think about constantly. What do we fear and how do we fear it? And Margaret Atwood has a really good quote about what men fear and women fear, and men fear being laughed at and women fear violence, right? Being
That's so
subjected upon them.
interesting because I love Wuthering Heights. I love like Jane Eyre.
Oh.
And I never even thought about like, it being inside the home across like those classic Gothics. Yeah, interesting. Am I allowed to ask a second
Of
question?
course.
Okay, so everybody's asking great questions that got my mind spinning. So my second question, so there's talk like when they're talking about the witches and surrounding the witches, about them like shedding skins and becoming animals, or people being turned into animals because of a spell or a curse. And I was wondering if you were familiar at all with like First Nations or Native American folklore, where they have something very similar called a skinwalker.
Yes, I have heard some stories that are part of Indigenous Canada or the Indigenous United States,
Yeah.
where you have creatures that transform into other things and become all kinds of different animals. It seems to be a common folkloric element that you see repeated. And
Same
sometimes,
with the blood sucking.
yeah, like the blood sucking. Sometimes the transformation has negative connotations. Sometimes it's something more neutral, where you just become something else. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I thought it was neat to see like similar. Yeah. And I had I think it was both of your books, especially this one. It was kind of my first foray into a lot of Mexican folklore and like the horror element. So yeah, it is really fantastic.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, that's all I have. I'm done talking.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, I'm gonna turn this back around
Yay.
to me. Not because it's all about me, but because it is 10 minutes past when I said we would wrap this up.
Yeah.
But this has been you have such thoughtful answers to every question. Like you have a reason for everything that you do. And I so appreciate that it's not just about marketing. It's not just about having a good title, that you seem to care deeply about the history and the folklore and the way that these stories fit into the past and into the present and into the future. So I really appreciate that. Again, what is the book called as I leave you, so that it's in people's minds as it comes out next summer?
It's going to be The Intrigue next summer. And so look for it in July.
Thank you so much for your time tonight, Sylvia. I so appreciate it. This was a wonderful conversation.
Oh, thank you, everybody. And yeah, happy book club. Happy Halloween as you move into that season.
Happy Halloween indeed.
All right. Yeah.
See you.
Take care.